Hey, everybody. You probably remember that one of the primary risk factors for election violence is if there is a recent history of election violence in a particular country. And sometimes people will ask me if I can give recent examples of election violence within the United States. So today I'm going to talk about a few of these things, and then I'll end with a little bit of a summary and a reflection. Let's start by talking about some of the severe threats against election officials that are happening in the 2024 election cycle in an ongoing manner. We have had enough people who have been threatening election officials, full-time professionals who have jobs that involve administrating elections, that many of these folks have actually resigned from their jobs and others have considered it. This is about people who are making phone calls to threaten the lives of people who are working in these jobs, in some cases to threaten the lives of the children and families of people working in these jobs. And regardless of what you think about the actual job performance of somebody who's in a position like this, the reaction of threatening their life or the lives of their children simply is election violence. It falls under that category of severe psychological violence. This is widely reported in political leaning newspapers and media across the spectrum. I've found reports about this in liberal and in conservative media. This kind of phenomenon is part of a wider phenomenon of people who call and threaten politicians and candidates from all parts of the political spectrum on a fairly regular basis. I've heard this talked about in interviews with representatives and former representatives. Sometimes people are not even threatening them directly, but instead threatening their staffers. Imagine calling up on the phone and threatening a 25-year-old intern. It just doesn't make any sense. It's really a serious problem. It's destabilizing, and it tends to make additional violence more likely because it just ramps up the temperature and makes everything really scary. Another example of recent election violence in our country is what happened on January 6th of 2021 at the Capitol building. I've done a whole video on this before, but as we're looking at this particular example, I want to remind us that it's important to remember there were three different groups of people present that day. There was a group of people who went there intending to be violent. That was why they were there. That was how they started. And then there was also a group of people who were there who were just never violent at all. And there was a big group of people in between who did become violent, at least in the sense of property destruction, and in some cases in the sense of physical violence, as a result of the crowd dynamics. They were ramped up by what was going on around them. This is why we focus so much on environment and thinking about the influence that we can have on whether we have a reactive or a non-reactive environment around us. Just because one person or one group of people becomes violent does not mean that the rest of us have to respond violently in kind. Other examples. Let's go back to 2022, the election cycle there. On June 8 of 2022, there was a man who intended to assassinate Brett Kavanaugh. That man actually ended up calling the police himself and saying that this was his intention, and they were able to intercede. But he was well armed, and he did get pretty close to the Kavanaugh's home. I also think about October 28 of 2022, the attack on Paul Pelosi, who is the husband of Nancy Pelosi. And this was somebody who we think was probably actually intending to attack Nancy Pelosi, but she wasn't there, so attacked an 80-year-old man husband instead. Now, let's be real here. There are a small number of people who are going to commit this kind of violence for reasons of their own. You know, there are always going to be isolated incidents of really serious violence like this. But the thing is, would either of those two things happen if, as a whole, we were not creating an environment of disdain for members of another political party or of contempt, if we weren't talking about things in a way that we were encouraging blame and otherizing and fear and anger? I don't know. I have no way of knowing and getting inside these people's heads, but it's a serious concern. Are these examples of election violence? Were they actually specifically motivated by the election cycle? I suspect that they were. I suspect that they were because the media had made these into election cycle related stories. The ideas of the actions of Nancy Pelosi and the confirmation or not of Brett Kavanaugh, because they were made into election stories, I suspect that we could say these attacks were forms of election violence. But another thing, because it's important to me that I always speak with as much integrity as I can, our country compared to other countries has, yes, some history of election violence, but not much in comparison with places that have had serious problems in other parts of the world. So, do we have examples of election violence in our recent history? Yes, I have just named a handful. There are more, especially if you look into local election cycles. There are, in some cases, considerably more. I want to make sure that you know that it's happening. I want to make sure that you know that it could potentially be a lot worse. And I want to make sure that you know that this is not a phenomenon that's entirely outside of our control. When we talk about election violence prevention, what we are talking about is making it so that these things are not normal and they do not feel necessary. And there are other ways to address the problems that we have. Next time we talk, I'm going to talk about finding your puzzle piece, figuring out what is the piece of all of this that I've been talking about that might actually belong to you.